The sky burned red with fire. The ground shook with the clash of steel. And in the chaos of blood and smoke, one man stood defiant against fate itself. His name was Ragnar Lodbrok. But what if I told you? History never told us the full truth of his final battle. The sound of waves crashes against jagged cliffs. A storm brews over the North Sea, lightning tearing across the black sky like Odin's own hand. A longship cuts through the waters, its dragon-headed prow rising and falling with the swell. Torches flicker in the rain, casting eerie shadows across hardened faces. And standing at the bow, cloak whipping in the wind, is a man whose name would echo for centuries, Ragnar Lodbrok. For centuries, Ragnar has been remembered as the fearless Viking king, the raider who terrorized Saxon shores, the scourge of Paris, the warrior who dreamed of Valhalla. But legends are slippery things. They twist with every telling. They hide truths beneath songs and sagas. And Ragnar's last stand, it wasn't simply a tale of death. It was a story of betrayal, prophecy, and the gods themselves. The sagas sing of a time when Ragnar was no longer the reckless youth, no longer the daring raider with bright eyes and endless hunger for conquest. He was older now, his beard thick with streaks of gray, his body scarred, each mark a reminder of a life lived in violence and glory. But in his heart burned something more dangerous than youthful rage, restlessness, the kind that comes when a man believes his destiny has not yet been fulfilled. Ragnar had conquered, feasted, and fathered sons who would one day shape the world. But whispers haunted him, whispers of fate. The seers spoke of a death that would not come on the battlefield, but in the coils of a serpent's pit. A humiliating end, not a warrior's death. And for a Viking, there could be no greater curse. The North was alive with stories, tales of Ragnar's exploits, sung by skalds around smoky hearths. But behind the songs, behind the laughter and the mead, lingered unease. For the gods are cruel, and every gift they give carries a shadow. Imagine it now. The halls of his kingdom, fires burning low, shields hung along the walls. Ragnar sits upon a carved wooden throne, staring into the flames. Around him, his men boast of raids past and victories yet to come. But Ragnar is silent. His eyes are distant, as if searching for something beyond the smoke. Outside, the winter winds howl. Ravens perch on the roof, black silhouettes against the moon. In the stillness, Ragnar whispers to himself, "What is a king if he does not face his fate?" He knew his sons were rising. Bjorn Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, names that would shake kingdoms. But Ragnar's pride would not let him fade quietly into the shadows of his children. His story was not finished. Not yet. So he did the unthinkable. He planned one final raid. Not for plunder, not for land, but for destiny itself. To carve his place into the memory of gods and men. The target? Northumbria, a Saxon kingdom ruled by King Ælla, a man who feared the Vikings like no other. Ælla's spies told him Ragnar was coming, but they did not tell him why. For Ælla believed he faced a raider seeking gold. In truth, he faced a man seeking immortality. The sea voyage was brutal. Waves rose like mountains. Rain lashed against the sails. Yet Ragnar's men followed him, for his name was legend, and his voice carried the weight of the old gods. As drums thundered and voices roared old war songs, Ragnar stood, cloak heavy with rain, his eyes set toward the horizon. When they landed, the Saxons were ready. Fields turned into battlefields. Mud swallowed boots. The clash of steel rang through the storm. Saxon shields shattered beneath Viking axes. But this was no raid. Ragnar led his men deeper, past the coast, past villages, into the heart of Ælla's land. It was madness. The Saxons swarmed them like a tide. Yet Ragnar fought as if each stroke of his sword was meant to carve his story into eternity. His men began to fall. Arrows rained. Horns blared. Blood mingled with the mud. Still Ragnar pressed on, eyes blazing with something beyond fury, something closer to prophecy. And then, silence. His men lay broken. The Saxons had him surrounded. Spears pointed, shields raised, and there stood Ragnar, alone in the storm. His sword cracked, his cloak torn, his body drenched in blood, not all of it his own. He laughed, a deep, wild laugh that carried across the field. Captured, he was dragged before King Ælla. Shackled, bruised, but unbowed. Ælla saw not a broken man, but a wolf still baring his teeth. The Saxon king demanded answers. Why had Ragnar come with so few men? Why march in a certain death? Ragnar only smiled. His eyes gleamed with secrets, and then he spoke words that chilled even his captors. I do not fear death, for I know where I am bound. I will walk into Valhalla alive. The court murmured. Priests crossed themselves, for in Ragnar's voice there was no despair, no plea, only certainty. He claimed that Odin himself had whispered to him in dreams, that a hall of golden light awaited, where the greatest warriors feasted for eternity, and that his death, his true death, had already been chosen. Ælla, furious, ordered a pit dug, a pit filled with serpents, venomous snakes hissing, coiling, writhing in the torchlight. The punishment meant to humiliate, to break, to show that even the mighty Ragnar Lodbrok could die a coward's death. But as they led him to the edge, Ragnar's voice thundered once more. How the little pigs will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffered. It was no cry of fear. It was a prophecy, a promise that his sons would avenge him, that rivers of blood would flow when they came for Ælla. And as the Saxons hurled him into the pit, the saga takes its most haunting turn. Some say Ragnar screamed as the serpents bit, that his body convulsed, his skin blackening from venom, that he died writhing, as any man would. But others whisper of something stranger, that Ragnar did not cry out, that the serpents recoiled, as if fearing the man they were meant to kill, that a golden light broke through the storm above, and in that light, Ragnar rose, not as a man, but as a warrior chosen. The pit fell silent. When the guards peered down, they swore he was gone. No body, only snakes hissing in the shadows. Did Ragnar Lodbrok truly die that day? Or did he walk into Valhalla alive? The truth was buried with time, but the legend only grew stronger.
Ragnar Lodbrok, a name that carried like thunder across the seas, a name that struck fear into the hearts of kings and priests, whispered in monasteries as fires rose behind wooden doors. He was no ordinary man. He was a storm wrapped in flesh, a raider who moved like a shadow across coasts unprepared for his fury. But behind that legend lay a man of blood and bone, ambition and rage. His tale, sung in sagas, told around fire-lit halls, was never meant to be only about battles. It was a story of prophecy, of destiny, and of how a mortal could step into the realm of gods. They called him Ragnar Lodbrok, Ragnar Shaggy Britches, a strange name for a warrior king. But every name in the north had meaning. Ragnar earned his from the fur trousers he wore into battle, coated in tar to protect against snake bites. Some claimed it was a charm from Odin himself. Others said it was madness. Yet when Ragnar charged with axe in hand and those breeches glistening black with resin, he looked less like a man and more like a creature born of myth. He rose not from noble birth, but from the sea. In the age when Viking clans fractured and warred, Ragnar became what all others feared, a king without borders. His first raids against the Franks and the Anglo-Saxons were small, sparks in the night. But sparks grow, and soon he commanded fleets of longships that carved across the sea like knives on water. His enemies spoke his name with curses. His men spoke it with reverence. And his wives, yes, Ragnar had many, saw in him a man destined for greatness, perhaps even touched by the gods. The sagas say he married Lagertha, a shield maiden as fierce as any man. Together they fought side by side until pride broke them apart. Later came a Slog, daughter of the dragon slayer Sigurd and the Valkyrie Brynhild. With her, Ragnar claimed bloodline to the very heroes of legend. It was not enough to be a king. Ragnar wished to stand shoulder to shoulder with the gods of Asgard. But the gods demand a price. In his youth, Ragnar was untouchable. With cunning and courage, he struck Paris itself, demanding ransom from the richest city in Christendom. The Franks, terrified, paid him gold to leave their gates untouched. He became not just a Viking, but a nightmare woven into prayers. Monks would write of him in trembling ink, their quills scratching by candlelight, begging their god to save them from the fury of the Northmen. Yet no prayer could silence Ragnar's hunger. Still, the sagas remind us, The higher a man climbs, the harder he falls. And Ragnar's sons, Bjorn Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, Hvitserk, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, would one day inherit his hunger. But first, they would inherit his curse. For Ragnar's end was not the clean death of a warrior on the battlefield. It was not the hall of Valhalla he had dreamed of since boyhood. His death would come in venom and fire. But to understand that end, we must first understand the man who walked toward it, blind to the fate the Norns had already woven. The Viking world was one of blood and belief. Burial rites were sacred. A warrior who died in battle might rise again in Odin's hall, welcomed by Valkyries who bore him away on wings of light. But a man who died in shame or in fear would never see Valhalla. Instead, he would wander the cold, gray mists of hell. Ragnar knew this. He craved the good death, the one that ensured a seat among the gods. It is why he charged into battles with reckless courage, why he dared to strike Paris, why he mocked the Saxon kings. To him, each battle was a gamble, each raid another chance to die in glory. Yet fate, cruel and strange, would deny him that simple ending. In the mead halls of the north, bards sang of Ragnar's wisdom as much as his strength. He was cunning. He knew when to fight and when to feign retreat. His shield wall was impenetrable, his tactics legendary. But his true gift was prophecy, or at least a belief in it. Ragnar claimed to have dreams of Odin, visions of wolves circling the earth, of dragons coiling beneath the sea. These dreams gave weight to his name. Men followed not just his sword, but his vision. And in those visions, Ragnar saw fire. He saw venom. He saw betrayal. By the time he was an older man, Ragnar was both feared and envied. Younger jarls and kings plotted his downfall. His sons grew restless, each eager to carve their own name from the bones of kingdoms. But Ragnar clung to one last ambition, to prove, once and for all, that no Saxon king could break him. His eyes turned toward Northumbria, and the man who ruled it, King Ælla. History tells us Ælla was cruel, a king who ruled with iron and punishment. Ragnar saw him as the perfect rival, the final test of his destiny. But destiny is a tricky thing. Some say it is written by the Norns, the weavers of fate, who carve men's lives like runes in stone. Others say men carve it themselves, with sword and fire. Ragnar believed in both. And so, in his final campaign, he set out with only a handful of ships against the advice of his men. It was not strategy, it was madness, perhaps even a death wish. For Ragnar had begun to believe the only way to enter Valhalla was not through victory, but through death itself. The Sagas tell us he whispered to his men, how the little piggies will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffered. A prophecy, a warning, a curse. Those words, carried in the wind, would outlive him. They would fuel the fury of his sons, ignite one of the bloodiest revenge wars in Viking history, and scar England forever. But before we reach that vengeance, before the snakes in the pit, we must walk with Ragnar through the storm of his legend. For every saga has two sides, the man and the myth. And in Ragnar Lodbrok, both were tangled so tightly that not even death could sever them. The North remembers Ragnar not just for how he lived, but for how he dreamed. His ships, his raids, his wives, his sons, all pieces of a puzzle that pointed to something greater than a single man, something eternal. A king who sought to break the boundary between Midgard and Valhalla. A warrior who believed he could walk into Odin's hall not in death, but alive. And that belief, that madness, would shape the destiny of his bloodline and the fate of nations.
In 865, Ragnar Lodbrok returned to English shores. But this raid was different. He sailed not with an army of thousands, but with a handful of loyal men. The once unstoppable Sea King was no longer at the height of his power, and in that weakness betrayal was waiting. Ragnar's decision to raid Northumbria baffled his sons. They had grown into rulers and warlords of their own. Bjorn Ironside commanded fleets across the Mediterranean. Ivar the Boneless schemed with cold brilliance. Yet Ragnar, restless, aging, and haunted by omens, insisted on one last journey. He gathered only a small band of warriors, men who would follow him anywhere. Their ships cut through the waves, but this time, no great fleet shadowed him. No vast war drums announced his arrival. Ragnar came quietly, almost as if he sought death itself. And perhaps he did, for in the Sagas, it is said Ragnar's heart grew heavy with prophecy, that he had dreamed of snakes, of poison, of chains tightening around him. He told his men, "If I do not return, my sons will avenge me. The earth will shake beneath their fury." They thought it was a boast, but it was a farewell that Ragnar's landing was met with resistance fiercer than expected. King Ælla of Northumbria had spies. He knew the Vikings were coming, and he would not face Ragnar in open battle. The Vikings marched inland, only to be swallowed by marsh and mist. Traps were sprung, arrows rained down, Saxon spears pierced shields. Ragnar's warriors fell, one after another, their blood soaking into English mud. The once great raider found himself surrounded, outnumbered, exhausted, his companions slain. Ragnar fought like a cornered wolf, his axe breaking shields, his voice roaring like thunder. But even wolves bleed, even kings fall. When they dragged him down, he was still snarling, cursing Ælla's name. His captors bound him in iron chains and hauled him before the king of Northumbria. King Ælla had long feared Ragnar's return. For years, the Sea King's shadow haunted his kingdom. Now he saw the man himself, older, scarred, but still fierce. Ragnar Lodbrok, Ælla sneered, the terror of Christendom, and now my prisoner. The Sagas say Ælla offered no mercy. He did not see a warrior. He saw a serpent to be crushed. Ragnar, bound but unbroken, met his gaze and laughed. "Do you think this end with me? My sons are coming, and they will carve your heart from your chest." His laughter unsettled even Ælla's men, for Ragnar's eyes burned not with fear, but with prophecy. Ælla had devised a punishment not of the sword, nor of fire, but of terror. He ordered Ragnar thrown into a pit filled with venomous snakes. The sight was grotesque, writhing coils, hissing jaws, fangs glistening with poison. The crowd jeered, the warriors spat, but Ragnar stood tall, chains dragging at his wrists. And then he spoke words that would echo through history. "The piglets will grunt when they hear how the old boar has died." With that, he was cast into the pit. The snakes coiled around him, their fangs piercing his skin. Venom burned through his veins. His body convulsed, yet his voice did not falter. He sang of Odin. He sang of Valhalla. He sang that his death was not an end, but a beginning. But behind the saga's poetry lies a darker truth. Some historians whisper that Ragnar was betrayed not just by fate, but by men. That Ælla was not the only hand guiding the fall. Some claim local chieftains, jealous of Ragnar's power, fed Ælla information. Others whisper that rival Norsemen, ambitious warlords, saw advantage in Ragnar's death. The sagas do not speak of this, but history often hides treachery in silence. What is certain is this: Ragnar's death was not just a punishment. It was a warning, a message to every Viking who dared cross English shores. But the warning backfired. For when Ragnar's sons heard of their father's fate, their fury would unleash something England had never seen before: the Great Heathen Army. Ragnar Lodbrok's chains could not silence his prophecy. His death in the serpent pit became more than a punishment. It became a spark, and from that spark would rise a storm so vast, so merciless, that kingdoms would tremble.
To the Saxons, it was mockery. To the Vikings, it was prophecy. Ragnar's words were not just defiance. They were a warning. His sons would hear, and when they did, the world would tremble. As Ragnar lay in Ælla's chains, his body broken but his spirit unbowed, he spoke words the Saxons could not understand. They thought him mad, delirious from wounds. But Ragnar's voice was steady, echoing like thunder across the stone walls. How the little piglets will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffered. To Ælla, it was a dying man's riddle. To the Vikings, it was prophecy. Ragnar was no ordinary warrior. He was a son of Odin, a chosen of the gods, and his death was not the end. It was the spark. The Saxons mocked him. Ælla believed killing Ragnar would end the Viking terror. But the king did not realize Ragnar's death was not a silence. It was a signal. The sagas tell us that Ragnar welcomed the pit, that as serpents bit into his flesh, he laughed, that his voice rose above the hissing snakes, crying, "The piglets will hear of this, and they will come." My sons will carve the land with fire and steel. Ælla thought Ragnar's words were madness, but every Norse ear that later heard them knew. This was the voice of prophecy. When news of Ragnar's death reached the north, it was not met with mourning. It was met with fury. His sons, scattered across the world, heard his words carried by messengers and skalds. Bjorn Ironside, sailing the Mediterranean, clenched his axe. Ivar the Boneless, crippled but cunning, whispered of vengeance. Sigurd Snake in the Eye, born with the mark of fate, swore an oath. And Ub, the loyal son, vowed that Ragnar's laughter in the pit would be avenged with the screams of Saxon kings. The words of Ragnar had become more than prophecy. They were a command. From the fjords of Norway, from the coasts of Denmark, from distant Sweden, they came, the greatest host the world had ever seen. The Saxons would call it the Great Heathen Army. But to the sons of Ragnar, it was a funeral march for their father, a storm born from prophecy. Ælla had laughed in his hall. Soon, that laughter would die in fire. Ælla's spies carried the whispers back to York. The sons of Ragnar were coming, an army unlike any the Saxons had ever seen. The king who thought he had silenced the Norse menace now realized he had awakened it. Ragnar's prophecy was unfolding, and Ælla stood at its center. He had slain the father. Now, the sons were coming for him. And yet, as the world shifted, as armies gathered, as the Saxons prayed for mercy, Ragnar's spirit walked free. The Sagas say he entered Valhalla laughing, serpents still biting his flesh. Odin welcomed him with a nod, for Ragnar's prophecy had already begun. For the north would rise in fire, the Saxons would weep, and Ragnar Lodbrok's name would never die. Ragnar's prophecy became the blood oath of his sons. His death lit the flames of the greatest Viking invasion in history. The question was no longer if vengeance would come, but how terrible it would be. Fade out, black screen, distant war drums echo.
Ragnar Lodbrok was gone, but death did not silence him. It amplified his voice. His blood had been spilled, his body torn apart, yet his prophecy remained. His sons, they would answer, and when they did, the land of England would drown in fire and steel. News of Ragnar's death spread across the seas like a curse carried by the wind. Bjorn Ironside, sailing the Mediterranean. Sigurd Snake in the Eye, ruling in Denmark. Hvitserk, restless in battle. And Ivar the Boneless, whose crippled legs hid a mind sharper than any blade. Each son heard the tale of Ælla's cruelty. Each swore vengeance. But it was Ivar who burned the fiercest. His crippled frame carried an unbreakable will. Where his bones failed him, his cunning prevailed. In 865, a force unlike any seen before descended upon England. The Saxons would call it the Great Heathen Army. It was not a raid. It was an invasion. Dozens of Viking jarls, bound by blood and by vengeance, united under Ragnar's sons. The Saxons saw them as monsters, demons from the sea. But to the Northmen, it was justice. Ragnar's prophecy fulfilled, and Ivar, he led them not with strength of arms, but with the strength of his mind. He saw the battlefield like a game of taffel, each move calculated, each sacrifice precise. King Ælla, who had thrown Ragnar into the pit of serpents, soon faced his reckoning. When the sons captured him, the Saxon king begged for mercy. But mercy had no place in Ragnar's legacy. The Vikings performed what the Sagas call the Blood Eagle, a punishment reserved for traitors and kings. Whether it was truth or myth, the Saxons remembered only one thing. Ælla died in agony, and Ragnar's vengeance was complete. But Ragnar's story did not end with vengeance. His sons carved their own fates. Bjorn Ironside sailed as far as the Pillars of Hercules, raiding Spain and the Mediterranean. Sigurd ruled with strength but was betrayed by kin. Hvitserk's path was one of endless wandering and blood. And Ivar the Boneless, his legend only grew. He conquered kingdoms, struck terror into England, and ruled like a god of war. Yet in his heart, it was always Ragnar's shadow he chased, his father's prophecy guiding him, his father's death haunting him. To the Saxons, Ragnar Lodbrok was a terror, a plague from the sea. To the Vikings, he was a hero, chosen by Odin himself. But in truth, he was both man and myth, a warrior whose death reshaped kingdoms, a father whose bloodline carved empires, a king whose name echoed across centuries. Ragnar Lodbrok died in a pit of serpents. Yet in Valhalla, he feasted among gods. And on earth, his legacy lived on through fire, steel, and the memory of vengeance. Ragnar's last battle was not his death, it was his legacy, and it still burns in every tale told of the Vikings.